I'm Michael Dixon and I'm Principal of Green Templeton College, Oxford. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Ann McPherson Memorial Lecture. This is the 8th in the series celebrating the late Dr. Ann McPherson, who, as many of you will know, was a Fellow of Green Templeton College. So I'm delighted to welcome you here to hear Philip Pullman speak on Whose Story Is It? Before we start the lecture, a few pieces of housekeeping. Due to the large number of people attending the event tonight, we're using Zoom webinar for the event. If you're not familiar with this format, please note that everyone will be on mute for this event and only the speakers are visible to the audience. This is due to the large number of people attending. Questions have been pre-submitted. Again, due to the large numbers, we've grouped these together to cover as many themes as possible. And the lecture will be recorded and will be added to the Green Templeton College website in due course. In a moment, I'm going to pass to Clem McPherson, who will first speak briefly about Anne and also the series of lectures, and he will also introduce our speaker, Philip Pullman. Clem is Emeritus Professor of Public Health Epidemiology at New College, Oxford. He worked for most of his time on breast cancer and coronary heart disease prevention. He was chair of the National Forum for Coronary Heart Disease Prevention and chair of the British Breast Group before retiring at around the millennium. He worked at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine as well as the University of Bristol, but most of his career was here at Oxford, largely since 1976. After Philip has spoken, without further introduction, we will pass on and Green Templeton College Associate Fellow Sian Rees will discuss with Philip the themes from the pre-submitted questions. Sian is Director of Community Involvement and Workforce Innovation, the Oxford Academic Health Science Network, and an Associate Fellow of the College. Sian leads work at AHSN to ensure that the views of patients and the public are part of all programs and collaborates with partner organizations to develop their capacity to do this too. She's recently taken on responsibility for developing a program for workforce innovation with an initial focus on the health and well-being of health and care staff. And my final point is that we aim to finish by 7:30 tonight, and we will endeavour to keep to time. So I'd like now to introduce Clem McPherson.
Clem, you're on mute.
Hello, good evening. It's a very exciting talk tonight, being 8th in the series of the Ann McPherson lectures hosted by Green College. I'm really speaking on behalf of my 3 children, Sam, Tess and Beth, who are integral to the whole process. As you will know, DIPEX was started by Anne a long time ago, 20 years ago, and recently celebrated its 20th anniversary. And it has more than 1 million people asking it questions this year so far. And what it intends to do is to bring healthcare or medicine closer to patients by enabling them to find out information about the disease they're interested in quickly and easily and readily online. And it's achieved that purpose several-fold. It was started by Anne and Andrew Herxheimer a long time ago, 15, 20 years ago, more, 25 years ago. And it's still widely used as an assistant to people who want to know about the illness they might or might not have. And on Health Talk Online, you can find out all the evidence about what causes it, how you treat it, and what happens subsequently. So it enables people to come to terms with their illness much more readily. Anne died 10 years ago in a few weeks' time, and we all miss her enormously, but nonetheless, her presence is felt by us all, and it's a cogent reminder, this annual event, because we all enjoy hearing from experts on aspects of what her work was all about. And in particular, Philip Pullman is known to us all as an author of children's books largely, and an inventor of fantasies which people find enormously enjoyable. And what he's going to talk about is the role of storytelling in understanding the world, and in particular, the role of storytelling in understanding health. So I hand over to Philip to give us his talk in this series. Thank you, Philip.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me and see me. I can hear myself, which is a start. Thank you for inviting me to give this lecture. I knew Ann McPherson a little, first many years ago when I was a teacher, and she was one of those daunting figures, a parent. And rather later when I became aware of her growing reputation as one of the most well-loved and respected doctors I'd ever come across. Her books, including The Diary of a Teenage Health Freak, which she wrote with Ann McPherson, and which has been in print for over 30 years, together with her work in making it possible for patients to record their own experiences of illness and recovery, with the creation of Health Talk and DIPEX, all made her widely known as one of the leaders of the movement towards encouraging doctors to listen to patients. Why it took over 3,000 years to think that was a good idea, I don't know. In fact, of course, the best doctors have always been listening to patients and thinking about what they hear. But Ann and her colleagues paved the way towards a wider and deeper and more open understanding of why it was important to take a humane and decent, as well as more effective approach to treating people who are suffering. It represented a great advance in the struggle to make this country a civilized place to live in, a struggle which is still ongoing. That she herself was struck down so cruelly was a blow that fate should really have held back from. Now, I'm not an expert in law or science or philosophy, certainly not in medicine. What I am is a storyteller, and the only things I can talk about with any knowledge are stories and how to tell them. So I'm going to look at what I take to be the basic abstract doctor-patient story and ask these questions. What kind of story is it? What form does it have? Is it like any other stories? And then what is the context? What's the social and cultural background in which the story exists? And then how does the story develop from the opening? And then a question which I've always found fascinating, where is the camera? Who is telling the story? Who hears it or reads it? And then is there anything an editor can do to improve it as a story? Can I steal it? Is there anything in it I can use myself? And with those things in mind, why is it being told in the first place? What's the function of this story? And finally, whose story is it? Now, when I talk about a doctor and a patient in this talk, in this lecture, in order to avoid him or herring, I'm going to imagine that the doctor goes by she and her, and the patient goes by he and him. And I'm leaving out altogether a question that would be the most important of all if we were talking about a story told in a court of law. Sorry, I just had an instruction telling me to start my video. I thought it was started already. I'll carry on. Yes, the most important question of all, if we were talking about a story told in a court of law and we were the jury, is this true or not? Is the witness lying, or can we rely on what he says? The difference between truth and lies, fiction and non-fiction, is not at all simple, and it would take not a lecture, but a whole series of lectures to resolve. So I'm going to accept that what the patient says is the truth, as far as he can remember it, and just look at what's happening when he talks about it. The questions I am going to examine, the ones I've just listed, are ones I'd ask about any story I was interested in. I'm being perfectly frank when I talk about stealing. I will pick up anything I see lying around. Any storyteller will do the same. We always have. As for the editorial business, that's part of the same attitude. I want to see things working properly, and I'm unapologetic about it. If there's a way to make them work better, I'll cheerfully interfere. When I was teaching, I always felt that the best way I could help someone learn to write was to look at their work like a sympathetic and experienced editor. The editor isn't concerned to give your work a mark and judge you on it, but to sit on the same side of the desk, as it were, and point out passages that don't quite work, and praise ones that do, and say why, and in general help the pupil, the writer, to express what they want to say a little more clearly and vividly. Sometimes that means helping them discover what it is they do want to say. So to the first question, what kind of story is the classic encounter between doctor and patient? Well, it begins as a story about a story. A patient comes to the doctor and tells her a story about a problem. This may be a problem the doctor has encountered many times before, or one she's never met. But in any case, the patient, despite what he might think, is not the only storyteller. His temperature and blood pressure, the way he walks, the size of his pupils, the liveliness or torpor of his manner, will all be telling the doctor their stories too. Sometimes their story is different from his. He might be afraid to mention something that her practiced eye picks up from the way he holds himself. He might not be a very good storyteller. He might put things in an unhelpful order, or not say enough, or say too much, or depend on trite and worn-out phrases to describe something more subtle than his command of language can express. He might not be a good listener. He might not have paid much attention in the past when other people were telling stories, so he hasn't noticed the importance of timing or detail or clarity when telling his own. But of course, perhaps he is. Of course, a doctor's experience will prompt her to ask the questions she needs answered if they don't come up in the patient's story, and if she needs to know something he wouldn't know the answer to anyway, like the state of his blood, she can arrange for that to be tested. So the patient's voice and the patient's body between them are telling a story, or rather, the beginning of a story. It's a story that the patient would like to have a happy ending, and so would the doctor, of course, and sometimes it does. A brief course of antibiotics and the story's over with the bad guys beaten and the patient hale and hearty again. What intrigues me as a storyteller is how classic the opening of that story is. All stories begin, if you think about it, with something going wrong. Your father dies in a mysterious way, and far too soon afterwards, his brother marries your mother. Something is rotten in the state of Denmark. Your mother gives you a basket of food to take to your grandmother who lives in the wood. Don't leave the path, she says. And what do? You leave the path and you meet the wolf. You're a brilliant, curious, passionate young natural philosopher, fascinated by the processes of life and the mysteries of electricity. Intent only on doing good, you create a living being animated by galvanism. But unfortunately, every story that ever was begins when something goes wrong. But back to our story in particular and the kind of story it is. Patient comes to doctor, doctor cures patient, patient goes home well again. That's the shape, of course, of 1,000 other stories, the most well-known of which, I suppose, might be the Sherlock Holmes stories of Arthur Conan Doyle. In the archetypal Sherlock Holmes story, someone comes to 221B Baker Street with a mystifying problem. Holmes investigates and solves it, and Dr. Watson writes it all down. We're familiar with that form. We've read things like it 100 times. We see them on TV every week. It's the basic form of the sitcom. The classic sitcoms all work like that. Phil Silvers as Sergeant Bilko, or Dad's Army, or Fawlty Towers. A small number of vividly characterized protagonists with instantly recognizable roles in an unchanging setting. A funny or dramatic event or events take place, and the characters react in predictable and enjoyable ways. When the crisis is over or the mystery solved, we go back to the church hall at Warmington-on-Sea, or to the Fort Baxter motor pool, or to 221B Baker Street, and order is restored. And there isn't just one episode, but a whole series of them that could theoretically go on forever. Each episode is identical in form with all the others. And this is where my second question comes in. The context, the social, the cultural, the technical world the story exists in. That sort of storytelling only became possible because of technical things as well as social ones. The development of steam-powered printing technology, a paper-making industry based on wood pulp, which in turn led to innovations in graphic design and ways of integrating illustrations and text, as in the famous Sidney Paget illustrations of the Sherlock Holmes stories. One of the main things that made Sherlock Holmes and his thousands of imitators successful was also a matter of technology and industry. The growth of the railways and the creation of distribution networks, meaning that the latest copy of the Strand magazine could be in Liverpool, Edinburgh, and Penzance almost as soon as it was published in London. Enterprising people like Mr. W.H. Smith realized that there was a captive market for newspapers and magazines in the new commuting class who took trains to work every day. And up there grew hundreds of station bookstores requiring monthly and weekly magazines full of short stories to read on the train. It all provided a rich soil in which the form of that kind of story could germinate and flourish. And later on, the coming of radio and television gave it another medium in which to grow. The soap opera and the sitcom, the documentary, the panel game, the political discussion program, all developed after the technology. The technology didn't develop because of them. Sometimes technology comes first. Take something like the comic strip. The ability to print words and pictures on the same page was available to William Caxton. And even the idea of the speech balloon, the essential comic strip element, existed in the 16th century. Fox's Book of Martyrs in 1563 is full of them. But no one thought of combining them to make a picture story until the cinema was invented and showed how to tell a story in a sequential series of pictures. From about 1890 onwards, like the cinema, comics were everywhere. It makes me wonder what other technology is sitting around us now, waiting for someone to find something rich and unexpected to do with it. Anyway, back to the story. That form, the sitcom, whether it's embodied by Sherlock Holmes or by Dad's Army, is so satisfying that we can read it or watch it again and again throughout a whole lifetime and never get tired of it. Well, let's go a little closer now and see how the opening of the story can develop. According to the celebrated journalist and skeptic Christopher Booker, who wrote an enormous volume on the subject, when it comes to stories, there are 7 possible plots. People who knew about stories were quite critical about this idea, and of course, it's ridiculous to say there are only 7 plots when there are, in fact, 11. But it does seem to many people who enjoy stories, whether on the printed page or on the screen, that there are not many different stories, fundamentally, that situations recur and repeat themselves endlessly in different settings, and possibly there are only 7 stories, or 11, or 3. One reason for this is the limited number of ways in which people can interact. Stories are not about trees or rocks or clouds, but about human beings and the kinds of relationship they can be in. And there aren't all that many of those. Parent and child, husband and wife, siblings, lovers, fortunate or thwarted, rivals, the eternal triangle, master and servant, the overthrow of a tyrant, and the medical story. The medical story contains at least 2 characters, the most important, of course, initially being the patient and the doctor. If he's having trouble with his prostate, for example, the ways in which the story could develop and the other characters who could become involved are well known and small in number. A urologist to whom he can be referred, possibly an oncologist, a surgeon, an expert nursing team, and so on. Their roles are clearly defined, their functions in the story easy to understand. And just as the patient can be a good storyteller or a poor one, sometimes those other characters can be good at their jobs or less good. A brusque and impatient specialist, for example, and I've heard that there are maybe a few such people, could make an important encounter during the story a matter of difficulty, unhappiness, and misunderstanding, and the story takes another turn. But sometimes, as well as the medical team, there's a shadowy company of ghosts whose part in the story is profoundly important. If the doctor is a psychiatrist and the patient is suffering from problems of a psychological nature, she, the doctor, will quite soon become aware of the presence of parents, of a partner, of children, and of a history of misunderstandings, of resentments, of cruelties and injustices and fears and guilts. And the company of ghosts that haunt the poor patient will almost become visible, jostling behind him and demanding attention themselves. Then there are other characters who aren't on any medical register at all. When I had a very long and increasingly miserable relationship with my bladder and my prostate, the doctors I consulted would refer to conditions they called urgency and frequency. To me, these 2 soon became aging sisters in a Gothic novel. Miss Urgency and Miss Frequency would pluck at my sleeve throughout the day and gibber at my bedside all night till they were finally exorcised by means of a ritual known as cystoprostatectomy, and they fled, never to be seen again, Imagining those two was a way in which I gained a little bit of control over the story myself. It didn't mean a thing to anyone else because I didn't tell anyone else, but it kept me slightly amused. Which raises the third question. Who produces this story? Who is telling it and how? Where is the camera? This is a harder question to answer than we might think at first. To go back to 221B Baker Street, it's clear who's telling the story. It's Dr. Watson. He's ideally placed to do so. He's absolutely trustworthy, straight as a die, honest and courageous and reliable, and, importantly, not quite as clever as Sherlock Holmes. The first-person narrator is someone whose function we understand very well. The narrator of David Copperfield, the book, is David Copperfield, the man, but he wasn't the author. Charles Dickens, the author, made him up and gave him the voice to tell the story in, and that's perfectly easy to understand. But who is the narrator of the book that begins, "It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife"? Jane Austen was the author, there's no doubt about that, but the voice that's actually telling the story isn't quite so easy to identify. It's a character we used to call the omniscient narrator, a being of some kind who looks at the characters from above, as it were, and knows all about them and the world they live in. That voice too is familiar to us because it became almost universal in third-person storytelling in the great age of the novel. 150 years after Pride and Prejudice, another author began a novel with the words, "The scent and smoke and sweat of a casino are nauseating at 3 in the morning." Different voice, but the same viewpoint. Ian Fleming might almost have begun, "It is a truth universally acknowledged that the scent and smoke and sweat of a casino are nauseating at 3 in the morning." The narrators of Pride and Prejudice and of Casino Royale are both saying, this is what the world is like, isn't it? Tolstoy's narrator in Anna Karenina speaks from the same position of sharing worldly experience. Happy families are all alike, but each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. He's expecting us to recognize that and agree with him, or to be intrigued and want to hear why he says it. But in each case, the appeal is to our common knowledge of how things are. The assumptions that authors of that sort of book could rely on, the shared understanding of the world, were baked in, as it were, a long time before any particular story was written, baked into writers and readers alike. They don't always last very well. If we read these days a novel of the 1920s or 30s, even one by such an eminent author as Graham Greene, we might find ourselves jarred uncomfortably by the constant reminders from the narrator that such and such a character is a Jew. We can see it very clearly in popular detective novels from the same period by such writers as Josephine Tay, which for all their cleverness are sometimes quite rancid with snobbery or racism. Those characteristics were probably quite invisible to those who shared them, the readers who bought the books or borrowed them from circulating libraries such as Boots. It was perfectly natural to condescend to working people or servants and to find foreigners either amusing or threatening. Everybody felt like that. It was the way things were. The omniscient narrator fell out of favor some time ago for a variety of reasons. The idea that any one eye should have a position of eminence, that any one gaze should prevail over any other, was felt by some readers and writers not to represent a democratic view of the world, especially because in most cases the eye seemed to belong to a white member of the middle classes, almost certainly male. Many readers came to feel that a first-person story was more authentic somehow, more democratically situated. Altogether, the question of who is telling the story and from what point of view or in what voice is a very important one. So who is telling the doctor-patient story and from what standpoint? What assumptions are baked into their voice? Well, the answer with our story at the moment is no one. There is no loyal and attentive friend taking notes in the consulting room. The patient isn't telling a story about his encounter with the doctor. She's not telling a story about her solving his problem. Not yet, anyway, though they each might later extract certain features of their encounter and put them in a story order and tell them to their family or to a medical conference. But at the moment, the only storyteller is me, us. We are looking at the events and organizing the way we tell them. Let's look at some ways in which we could begin the story in the voice of a third-person narrator. How about this? When blonde 32-year-old Dr. Celia Lovejoy sat in her sun-filled consulting room that May morning, little did she know that, well, it's a start, but I think the camera is in the wrong place. Let's come out a bit and try again. After the military and political catastrophes and chaos of the first half of the 20th century, Great Britain emerged in 1945, exhausted, depleted, but determined to... I can see where we're going, but again, the establishment of the NHS isn't quite the best place to start. We need to find a voice that's cooler and further back than the first, and warmer and closer than the second. What about the voice that tells the great fairy tales? Once there was a man who woke up to find his body covered with a bright red rash. What's more, he felt as if stiff bristles were growing all over him. Well, don't complain to me, said his wife. Go and see the doctor. He hurried to the local medical centre and... I think we're getting closer, but the tone is still wrong somehow. Perhaps we need to look at who's actually involved in the business of producing a story and receiving it. When we consider a novel, for example, whatever kind of novel, it's tempting to think that there are no more than two people involved, the writer and the reader. But actually, that's only a start. There are several others. There's the real writer, the individual called, as it might be, David Cornwell, whose real background, whose nature and true personal life story we might know a little about, but only as much as he wants us to know. Most of him is hidden and known only to his immediate family and friends. Then there's the author, called, as it might be, John le Carré, whose voice and appearance are freely revealed in interviews and publicity pieces, but whose public face is partly an artifact carefully constructed by the real author and his publishers and agents, together with the unconscious cooperation of the readers, who gather what they can from those things as well as from the text itself. This is the figure known to narrative theorists as the implied author, though I prefer inferred author, since most of the work of building them up is done by the readers. Then there's a third figure, the narrator, whom we've met already and who is different from either of the first two. Then there's the real reader, an actual person whose identity is unknown. Whatever assumptions or experiences or preoccupations or expectations he or she brings to the experience of reading, we can't know or control or dismiss them or take them into account. The real readers buy the book or borrow it from the library, and we know how many there are of them because of the point of sale figures and the public lending right returns, but that's pretty well all we do know about them. We don't even know if they actually read the book once they've taken it home. Then there's another reader, who is the one the book seems to expect. A book called Butterworth's Company Law Handbook 34th edition doesn't seem to expect the same sort of reader as one called Dead Dames Don't Squeal. That doesn't mean that books always get the readers they seem to expect, or that those are the only readers they do get. The real reader, the actual person reading Dead Dames Don't Squeal, might be the Archbishop of Canterbury. I don't know what goes on in the vestry, but the book doesn't seem to be expecting that somehow. All these shadowy figures are there in different proportions and at different times when an act of reading is going on. We might be aware of them or not. We might think they matter, or we might be quite indifferent to them. Some of them are rather nebulous, though undoubtedly real. Somewhat more solid are other figures in the background: publishers, editors, designers, printers, booksellers, both wholesale and retail, librarians, literary editors, and so on. But they don't have quite so much bearing on our doctor-patient story, so we'll leave that field untilled and go back to my fourth question. Is there anything an editor can do to improve it as a story? Is there anything I can steal? And with those things in mind, why is it being told in the first place? What's the function of this story? But that immediately raises another question. Do stories have a function at all? One of the greatest storytellers there ever was, Jesus of Nazareth, clearly believed they did. He told his parables, unforgettable. You only hear the story of the Good Samaritan once and you know it for the whole of your life. Brief and brilliant, for a purpose, in order to change the behavior of his listeners. They were purely instrumental, those parables. They had a job to do. But do we believe this about all stories? What is the purpose of stories or art in general? Oscar Wilde was in no doubt. All art is quite useless, he said, in the preface to the picture of Dorian Gray. He expanded this a little by saying, a work of art is useless as a flower is useless. A flower blossoms for its own joy. We gain a moment of joy by looking at it. That is all there is to be said. That was, of course, the carefully expressed view of the most celebrated representative of a moment in cultural evolution which came to be known as decadence. But that view isn't universal by any means. There are plenty of other opinions about the usefulness or not of stories and art in general. 30 or 40 years after Oscar Wilde, Joseph Stalin was talking about writers as the engineers of human souls, whose only function was to write novels and plays that conformed to the dictates of socialist realism and thus hastened the revolution and the dictatorship of the proletariat. No purpose at all, said Wilde. A ferocious and implacable purpose, said Stalin. And the function of the story told by our patient to our doctor is straightforward. He wants to get better, to stop hurting, to be reassured, to know what's happening to him, to be healed. Samuel Johnson has so often put his finger on the nub of the matter when he said that the only purpose of writing was to enable the reader better to enjoy life or better to endure it. We need Shakespeare, and we also need P.G. Wodehouse. But we'd never get either of them, as I pointed out earlier, without a context and a means of production and distribution, and one that enables the author of a story to earn a modest living for doing the job as well as they can. And part of this context involves knowing how stories work and seeing how to make them work better. The knowledge and experience of a good editor is a great thing. And we can find the sort of editorial experience we need in all sorts of places. I've quoted this example many times, so I apologize to anyone who's heard me do so before, but it's such a brilliant insight into the art of storytelling that I can't resist doing it again. Alfred Hitchcock pointed out that if you begin a film at night with a burglar breaking into a house and going through the rooms, looking in drawers and wardrobes, opening cupboards, and then he sees the lights of a car drawing up outside, we don't think, here, he's in the front bedroom. We think, quick, get away, they're coming. Our sympathy and interest belongs, to begin with anyway, with the first character we see. Is this a story about Dr. Celia Lovejoy or about her patient? It makes a difference. In the case of our story, I think many of us would say that the patient is where our empathy gathers most naturally. That's where the focus should be. We can easily understand and imagine the state of anxiety, perhaps of fear that this patient feels, and the hope and trust he places in the expertise and sympathy of the doctor. The patient is us. We have been the patient, or we might easily be the patient in the future. Our relationship with the doctor in this story is more distant, more respectful perhaps. She's a figure of power, authority, knowledge. The patient is the supplicant. She is the dispenser of reassurance and healing. But that is to make a great assumption about the nature of this particular story. I've been talking about it all the way through as if it were a pitch for a TV episode, for example, which would go on to have a fully written script and a director and a designer and actors and all the technical and organizational apparatus that holds the thing in place and makes it fit the pattern, like every other episode in the series. The implication of the way I've been describing it is that the story is something created and presented to an audience or a readership. And it's like that because I've been talking about what I know. And that's the way I've been thinking about stories for most of my life. But that isn't what happens when we really go to the doctor. There is no writer looking on. There is no director waiting to take charge. There is no one to cast the right actors to play the doctor and the patient. There is no telling of a story going on. Stories are made of events, but events themselves are not the story. The story is something shaped and polished, edited by someone outside the events. And there ain't no such person in real life unless one of the participants decides to take on that role later on. So by a process of implacable and unyielding inexorability, I come to the question I used at the title of this lecture: whose story is it? In the case of a novel, we might say the story belongs to the person who holds the copyright and gets the royalties, and I wouldn't disagree with that. Or we might say that it belongs in a different sense to the person who reads it and is transformed by it, which is the case when a young reader finds the perfect book for that stage of their life and never forgets the impact it made on them. I certainly wouldn't disagree with the idea that it belongs to them too. Can we also say that the story belongs to the person who makes it into a film? Well, yes, in a legal sense, it does belong to them. They bought the right to do exactly that. Or we might say that the story belongs in a metaphorical sense to the most memorable characters in it. Treasure Island belongs to Long John Silver. Wuthering Heights belongs to Heathcliff and Cathy. But who does the doctor-patient story belong to in any of the senses I've just examined? Whose story is it? Well, as I said a moment ago, I think that the person to whom this story most fundamentally belongs is the patient. And that being so, and since the story is true, it's most naturally told from the patient's point of view in the patient's own voice. But most naturally doesn't necessarily mean best or most effective. Stories have to be organized if they're to be of any help. If they're going to do any good or bring us joy or help us to endure, they need editing. They need to be seen in a framework or a context that tells us what sort of story this is and in what way it's most helpfully read. There comes a point, though, when stories falter. There comes a point eventually when the patient has told all he knows. Bearing Samuel Johnson in mind, when it comes to enduring things, we have to consider the end of life and those patients who are approaching it. Stories about death can only be told from the outside. Only myth or imagination can take us beyond the point at which life ends. It seems to me that if a patient, a child in particular, is anxious or terrified about dying, we are justified in telling them any stories that will help. Those who criticize religion on the grounds that it's not logical, not scientific, not verifiably true, are missing the point entirely. The function of religion at points of extremity is to comfort, not to instruct. If it helps, it doesn't matter if it's not true in a scientific sense. And here, traditional stories, whether religious or mythical, can be valuable, or in my terms, worth stealing. Myths in particular give us a template for thinking about the unthinkable. Classical stories do have accounts of heroes going into the underworld and coming back to tell us what they found there, sometimes successfully, as with Aeneas questioning his father Anchises and learning the things he wanted to know, sometimes unsuccessfully, as with Orpheus trying to restore Eurydice to life and almost getting back safely. So when I found myself having to invent a scene in which my heroine Lyra has to go into the world of the dead in order to rescue her friend Roger, whom she swore to find and bring home when he was kidnapped, I thought I might manage if I trod a classical path. I knew I had to write this scene in order to make sense of the whole story, but I was very nervous about it. However, encouraged by the classical accounts of descents into the underworld, I set off with her. Lyra finds the world of the dead a bleak, vast, cold place, crowded with innumerable ghosts who are guarded by vicious and cruel harpies. The ghosts of the children in particular have forgotten what it was like to be alive, and they want her to remind them, to tell them a story about it. Until that point, Lyra has told nothing but lies. But now, when she tries to tell a story in her familiar, everyday, fantastical way, the harpies fly at her, shrieking. And still the ghosts of the children crowd around, demanding that she tell them what the sunshine was like, what it was like to play, about the mud by the river and the smell of potatoes cooking in a fire. And so she does. She summons the memories of the physical world that she loves and that all the ghosts loved so much, and tells them about a day she spent playing by the river with her demon Pan, and with Roger too, whose ghost nods eagerly to confirm the truth of everything. And then Lyra notices that the harpies have fallen still, that they too are listening. The truth about the world was what they needed as well, and they didn't know it. And the harpies make a bargain. From now on, they will guide the ghosts through the labyrinthine world of the dead to a spot where they can emerge into the world again, at which point they'll dissolve and all their particles will combine with the air and the sunshine and the rain and the grass and the birdsong. But there's a price, say the harpies. When you enter the world of the dead, you must have a story to tell. And it must be a true one about the things you've loved and noticed when you were alive. If you go to the world of the dead with nothing to tell about the life you lived, you won't ever leave it. Lyra thinks that's fair, and so do I, actually. Noticing the world is the only way to come back to it. So they make the bargain, and the story continues. The old classical notion of the underworld is enormously rich. These things belong to us all, and we can use them in any way we like. There is no orthodoxy in forcing a canonical version that must not be altered. You won't be condemned or punished for telling it differently. This, for me, is the most valuable thing of all where stories are concerned. They're malleable. They lend themselves to all kinds of settings in any number of different tones. You can borrow things or steal things, as I did in that story about Lyra in the world of the dead, where she has to go across a river in a boat to get there. As I say, these things belong to us all. That's really all I know. I can't finish, though, without a heartfelt word of gratitude and admiration for those who are professionally and personally involved in the care of the sick, and those who have created and maintained in DipX and Health Talk a way for those who know sickness and suffering, to tell their stories in the first person, in a rich and generous and well-ordered context. What we see in the many wonderfully informative interviews we can find online is not raw and unmediated footage, but excerpts skillfully chosen and edited. Without this process of shaping and cutting and selected, the most palpably real and true interviews would be of little use because we wouldn't be able to find the one we wanted, the one of special relevance to us. In the past year, we've had a brutal lesson in the way we're all connected. The pandemic has shone a new light on the events of our lives and our politics, and some parts of them have not shown up very well. But the work of nurses and doctors and scientists has been magnificent, probably far more so than we deserve. As for the NHS, if this government lets it slip out of public hands and into the pockets of large corporations, it will be remembered only as a lesson in the records of infamy. All I have left to say with everyone else is thank you.